All right. So the next disease I want to talk about is chronic wasting disease. And we could all sit in this room all night and we could put our heads together and we could try to come up with a more insidious, crazy disease than chronic wasting disease to kill deer, and we couldn't come up with anything near this. This disease is really insidious. So it's called a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy, and what that means is it's transmissible from animal to animal, and it takes these, when you look at the tissues, the nervous tissue, under a microscope, it looks like a sponge. There's all these holes in it. That's where the spongiform comes in. The most famous of these disease is mad cow disease. Other examples would be scrapie in sheep, kuru in people, and there's some others. This particular one can go from deer to deer, and it spreads between deer, seems very easily, very efficiently. It's not caused by a virus. It's not caused by a virion. It's not caused by a fungus or a bacteria. It's caused by a prion, a misfolded prion. And these prions are just proteins, and we have normal prion proteins in our cells, and all animals do. They're not quite clear on exactly what their purpose is and what they do, but when they are malformed and malfunctioning, they lead to cell death. So the way this works is, let's say that the normal prion protein is shaped like this. And when a diseased prion protein is introduced to it, it can induce this one to misfold as well. So once it's misfolded, it's very difficult, almost impossible to unfold it. And this one has the ability to make the one next to it misfold, and so on and so on. And it's a cascading effect. And when you get enough of them dead, the cells start, misfolded, the cells start to die. To give you an idea of how stable these are in the environment and in the materials that we're looking at, when I'm looking at a deer that I think has chronic wasting disease, if we've dealt with some chronic wasting disease positive material, in order to disinfect the table and inactivate any prions that might be there, after I clean off all the gross filth and stuff and get it in the garbage can, we have to soak the tabletop in 2 normal sodium hydroxide, which is a very strong base, or 50% bleach solution, with an hour contact time. We have to let it sit on there for an hour to inactivate these prions. Or we can burn them at 1800 degrees for an hour, which is how we get rid of our waste. So we have a pathological waste incinerator. We burn both chambers at 1800 degrees. If I was burning a suspected CWD case or a known CWD case, we would burn it for an hour at those temperatures, take the ash out, soak the ash in 2 normal sodium hydroxide overnight, drain the hydroxide off, and then put the ash back in the incinerator for another cycle. So we guarantee that we're trying to guarantee that no prions escape our laboratory. Anyway, these prions, based on what we know about scrapie, which is another prion disease, and probably the progenitor, the grandfather of CWD, we know they can last for 15 to 16 years in the environment, just like sitting there, and they can still be infective. Deer shed these prions, once they're infected, they shed them in their saliva, in their feces, and in their urine. So they come out pooping and peeing wherever they poop and pee. If there's prions in there, those prions are there for 15 years potentially, waiting for another deer to come have contact with them, and it can start the whole thing over again.
Say a plant grew in that area where that urine or feces was. Would that plant adapt? Is there any plants that would draw that protein up?
Yeah. So they'll bring the prions up into the plant tissue, and they make it more convenient for the next deer to get it when they eat the plant material.
Yeah, it's just deer, no other animals are affected by this?
So as far as we know, so it's the cervids, so it's white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, moose, there's other deer. Reindeer is a new one, yeah. That reindeer are infected, but there's another one that I'm not thinking about. What's that? Red deer, yep. Red deer's the other one. It's always fatal. There's no vaccine. There's no treatment. There seems to be no immunity. So this is the latest USGS map on the locations of chronic wasting disease outbreaks. Red dots are captive service facilities that have chronic wasting disease detected in them, and they haven't been depopulated yet, which is a really bad idea unless you want to make more prions. So I'm not quite sure the political things that are going on here to allow these guys to keep these deer. Yellow dots are captive service facilities that where chronic wasting disease was detected, and they went in and depopulated all the deer. So you'll notice a couple of things. Kind of a lot of cases out here. Colorado is where it all started, in a captive facility there at a university. They had elk and they had scrapie sheep in the same pen for an extended period of time. And the popular thinking is that the scrapie kind of mutated and went into the elk, and that's what chronic wasting disease is. Back when this all happened in the 60s, no one had any idea what it was. It took them many years to determine that it was actually a prion disease. They took the elk out of those pens, they let them sit fallow for a year, and they got some new elk in, and they came down with it, same thing happened. Well, they took them out again, and they scraped off the top layers of soil. And I think they've sprayed some kind of disinfectant on there, and then they brought in new elk and they came down with it again. So these gray areas are areas where it's in the wild. Back in the 60s and 70s, they were doing some work with alternative agriculture. Farms are in trouble, so they're looking for other ways they could make money. And they thought that venison farming, certainly would be a good way. So they moved some of the elk and stuff here up into Canada to start some farms up there. They sent some to North Korea, so they've got it in North Korea. The way that this thing really moved around initially was by moving live animals, right? So think of like SARS, how SARS started. It was over in Asia, where they first found it, and it was in the United States like in no time because people got on planes and they flew. Moving live infected people around is kind of the same way that this got started, moving live animals around. You'll notice that we've got a yellow dot. Back in 2005, we had an outbreak in New York, and I'll talk about that in a second. You'll notice that we've got a lot of red dots and stuff here in our neighbor to the south. This is going to be a huge headache for us. This is a huge problem for us. And this yellow dot is last year, 6 miles from the border in New York. So back in 2005, actually back in 2002, it was detected in Wisconsin. And that really woke a lot of us up east of the Hudson or the Mississippi River. We said, uh-oh, it's across the river. So we started really looking for it hard. And we've always had this pretty good relationship with Agamarkets. So Agamarkets is sensitive to some extent to our concerns about wild deer. And they decided, well, we're going to start a testing program on all of our captive cervids. We have about 200 deer operations in New York, captive deer operations. And in 2005, the person that owns this farm, he had donated a deer to the local fire department for a game dinner. And that was one of the ones that he elected to have tested. And that one turned up positive. So Agamarkets, they started the process of trying to trace back to see where all of his deer had gone, if he had moved any other ones, and he had given some to his buddy over here at this other farm. And there was some hemming and hawing about the indemnity, because we wanted all the deer killed, but they have to pay. You can't just take somebody's deer. It's their personal property. You can't just go in and kill them. You have to pay them. And there was some haggling over the price with Agamarkets. And luckily at the time, the division director of Fish and Wildlife said, we'll buy the deer. Just pay him what he wants. So DEC actually bought the deer. We had USDA sharpshooters go in, kill all his deer, kill the deer on the other farm, test them all for chronic wasting disease. I think there were, as I recall, there were 2 more positives on his farm, 1 positive there. We drew 5 and 10 mile circles around there. And within a couple of weeks, we went in there using the emergency manager, EM emergency. We did something emergency like hands on deck, all hands on deck thing. Emergency management system, that's not the right word. I can't think of it. Brian would know, but he's not in here. So we had a lot of staff, law enforcement. We went out there. We got USDA sharpshooters to help us out, and we wanted to kill as many wild deer as we could. And we killed just under 300 deer before the fawning season, and spring turkey season was starting, I think. And in those wild deer, we found 2 in the wild that had it. It was an adult doe and a near yearling fawn from the previous year, a buck. And then we never found another one. So we may have gotten very lucky, and there wasn't, we found this one early enough. There wasn't enough environmental contamination to keep it going, and other deer didn't come into contact with it. So we made it so you couldn't take any deer out of that area. Any deer taken in there had to be tested. There was no wildlife rehab in that area. You couldn't possess a roadkill deer in that area. Everything needed to be tested. We did that for 5 years. We didn't come up with any other positives. We went in and killed another 50 deer. Didn't find it, so we kind of disbanded the containment zone. And this was a big hardship for the sportsmen that live in this area. There was a lot of grumbling and stuff. And you can imagine if you're in this area where you hunt, it's a huge pain in the butt. This particular farm, when they did the investigation, there was definitely some issues. In addition to being a deer farmer, to supply, shooting preserves with shooter bucks. He also had, he was a deer transporter, so he would move deer for other farmers. He had a trailer. He had some tranquilizing stuff, so he would do that kind of work for people. He was a taxidermist, and he was doing taxidermy work from deer out west where chronic wasting disease is endemic. So it may have come in that way. And then he was also a wildlife rehabilitator that specialized in wild fawns. So he had wild fawns in his facility, and they were mingling with the taxidermy stuff. I mean, it turns out to, in hindsight, it was really a bad situation. So the way it works, the deer gets infected with this prion. It gets exposed to potentially one prion. We think the infectious dose might be one of these prion proteins. He gets infected, and it gets into his system, and it starts to multiply. And after like 2-3 months or so, then he starts to shed the prions in his saliva and his urine and his feces. And the sneaky part is, now for another year, 2 years, maybe even 3 years, depending on the deer, he's going around and he's spitting out prions and pooping them out, and he looks perfectly fine. You can't tell there's anything wrong with him. He's acting normal. So you can't cull him out of the herd because you don't know which one has it. And every time he poops and pees, you got another clump of prions on the environment that are just sitting there waiting for another deer to come across. So after 2 to 3 years, then they start to get sick, and you get into the disease's namesake, this chronic wasting syndrome, where they stop eating and they start to get skinny. And the classic pose is like their front legs are kind of out, bracing themselves for balance. Their head's down, their ears are drooped, and just drool is just coming out of their mouth. That isn't usually seen on the landscape, and the reason for that is, towards the end of the normal period, we can't tell with our eyes. Research has shown that they're just not as with it as they should be. So they're much more apt to be predated, by coyotes or out west by mountain lions, etc. Shot by hunters, hit by cars, because they're just not as wary as they normally would be. And then they eventually die. And if they die on the landscape, now the prion load is huge, especially in the brain and the spinal cord. So the carcass is laying there. Depending on the season, if scavengers come and they eat it, if soaking it in 50% bleach for an hour is what it takes to kill it, a trip through a coyote digestive tract or a crow digestive tract is like a ride at Disneyland for the prion. It just gets pooped out, a mile away, and now you've got prions in another spot. So the way that it typically moves, and we saw this, natural deer movements, right? So this is what we're worried about in that case in Pennsylvania, that's 6 miles from the border. Young male deer disperse 5-10 miles a year, sometimes even 20, depending on the deer and the situation. So you're going to have natural deer movements are going to move it. Every year it's going to be moving farther and farther out from where it started. Human movement of infected carcasses or live deer. So they've kind of clamped down. Well, some states have clamped down. New York State, they can't really move any live deer. They can't bring any live deer in from outside of New York. And in order to move deer from farm to farm in New York, they have to get written permission from Ag and Markets and from DEC if it's whitetails. But now we're worried about carcasses, right? So if I go down to Pennsylvania and I shoot a deer that's infected, and I bring it back to my house in Brunswick, and I butcher it in my garage, right? I got all my scraps and the bones and stuff. Well, I don't want to waste these. I'll put them out for the critters to eat. If that's got chronic wasting disease, now you're setting that out there and you're creating another disease area right in your own backyard where you don't want it. And also, if you're using it for coyote bait, same thing. Moving them around is definitely an issue. We're concerned about deer urine. So I told you that the prions are in the saliva, the feces, and the urine, and I say it in that order every time because that's the concentration. The highest concentration of prions is in the saliva. The second highest concentration is in the feces, and the urine has pretty low concentration, but they are in the urine, so that's a concern. All the urine that is sold commercially comes from deer farms, which are the highest risk for CWD, and they don't know their deer have CWD. Because they look normal, they're acting normal. So if you're making a mock scrape or something at your favorite hunting spot, and you pour a little in, and if you're like a lot of people like me, I say, oh, a couple drops is good. You can get a couple bottles in there. You're setting up a whole another area, and there's no real hard evidence that urine really helps. There's certainly studies that have shown that if you just make a scrape with your foot and don't put anything in it, the deer are going to come investigate it. I mean, they're pretty curious critters. Or if you pee in it yourself using your own pee, it probably has just as much chance of attracting the deer as the deer urine does. And then you were talking about it going into the plant material. Once people start to put it together, that these prions are being brought up into the plant material. What about, do you want to buy corn and hay from an area where there's a lot of CWD, like out west, and move it to another part of the country?
Yeah, because how much hay, look at some of the big farms around here, who ship hay out. How much hay do they ship from out west?
I don't know.
Like into the northeast?
Just
Like
during
tractor trailer
season.
loads.
During the track season, look how much hay goes in here.
Yeah, that's something to consider, that nobody's really thinking about that too much currently. So this is kind of what drove the captive cervid industry, and still does to some extent, are these kind of mutant Franken deer that are created by back-crossing deer with their mother. And it's just selective breeding to get these mutant-looking deer. And people will pay $20, $30, $50, $60,000. For you and me, that's a ton of money. But for some people, $60,000 is like finding a quarter in your pocket. It means nothing. And so when you got this kind of money involved, then you get deer being moved around, sometimes at night and illegally. So this is a big concern of ours. And this is kind of a little bit of a demonstration of the way that these captive deer get moved around. This was done by a graduate student in Pennsylvania, and this shows the movement of deer 1 year. This is the reported movement. In Pennsylvania, you don't really have to report movements, but this is how the deer were moving around between the different captive cervid facilities there. There's some farms that they just specialize in raising fawns. So all the fawns you get, one farm will get, they'll send them out to hit that one to get raised, and then they come back, because that fawn raising is kind of labor intensive if they take them away from their mother.
Once they're infected, how long before they test positive?
Depending on the test you use, so there's no certified live test for deer, which is a problem,
So if the
right?
deer was infected yesterday and then it dies by roadkill, would it test positive
No,
today?
absolutely not.
Okay.
And I don't know the answer to your question. I expect it would take a couple months before we'd start to see it. So we know that you'd probably first see it in the tonsils and in the retropharyngeal lymph nodes, like right up here in the mouth, because they're probably the first that are infected. And that's the tissue we use in New York for our surveillance.
Now, the meat of these infected animals, they can go for up to 3 years without showing any signs of being infected.
Right.
What effect does that have on the meat?
Well, the meat's going to have some prions in it if it's infected. So the big question is it going to go into people? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see you were going, I see you were heading that way. I may have a slide on that, but I'll definitely talk about